So, good. Then that's good. Yeah, the thing is, it's there's singing outside, so that's why I closed it. So maybe let's That's, after a time it gets. I mean, it's nice singing actually, but it gets a little bit annoying after some time. If you are trying to do something else and not enjoying the sunshine and the museum island. Okay, so welcome to the second workshop for all of you, I guess, also for me. The Berlin-Oxford Summer School for transparent, open and reproducible research. And the topic here are Cobidas and bits, which are kind of transparency, reproducibility, encouraging initiatives within the brain imaging community. And what I hope you get out of this workshop, and also get maybe out of yesterday's workshop for those who were there for the CC licenses and stuff, is more an awareness that these things exist rather than a detailed knowledge about anything. So this is how you should, should view the whole week. So you become aware of things, but you cannot, like always in science, assume that just by attending an SPM course for 3 days or so, you become a new imaging person. You just attended. Thank you. You just attended an SPM course for 3 days and you became aware that SPM exists. So this is why they do these courses, not because you really learn what's going on with SPM or Cobidas and bits. So please keep that in mind. So essentially we are done already because you became aware of these things. But we will hopefully do a little bit more in terms of details. So the outline for the workshop is as follows. So for those, I think it's only you, right? You were there yesterday. So the aim is that I briefly give an introduction. And today, I think it will definitely be brief, shorter than yesterday. And then you do a little bit of an exercise, and for Cobidas and also for bits. So this thing with exercises and hands-on stuff, some people strongly believe in that. Some students also strongly believe in that, and there are other people who don't strongly believe in that, and also some students that don't strongly believe in that. So do with that what you want. So if we get to the exercise, either do it or decide you rather take a break and you want to deal with that in your own time. So nothing is mandatory, and it's not an exercise where you get a mark for it. Yeah. So if you think it's useful, do a little bit. If you think it's more useful that you ask me questions, whatever. Okay. So trying to make everyone happy. Good. And the outline is that the first part of the workshop will be devoted to Cobidas and the second part to bits. All right. So then let's start with Cobidas. And essentially, I mainly would like to give you some background of where this is coming from and what it entails. But also not going into all the details, definitely, because that's something that I think is actually something that you can do in an exercise. So the material, especially Appendix D of the Cobidas report, is available on the OSF project. So this is something you might actually already want to open so that you get a feeling of what we are actually talking about here, because I could have brought handouts, but then I thought that might be paper waste a little bit. Look at it now or later, but it's everything that I'm talking about are just documents that are on OSF. No? Maybe you can also share a laptop over there. Good. So what is the Cobidas report? What's the background? So From my perspective, I wasn't part of the Cobidas committee, although I applied, but they didn't want me. From my perspective, the Cobidas, I was a little bit junior maybe at that time. So and still are, of course. The main idea of the Cobidas report and this initiative by the Organization for Human Brain Mapping, from my perspective, was a preemptive action to the perceived reproducible crisis. So has anyone, who of you has been to HBM, the conference? So it's actually not... No, in general. Just to check out who's aware of that OHBM exists. Okay, so that's kind of a majority, but the other people know that that's a conference where you can look at a lot of resting states these days. Sorry, it's with milk. Okay, so the story behind this is also relating to stuff that you've seen yesterday and maybe became aware from some of the papers also on the OSF project. So maybe since the mid-2000s, there's a little bit of an accumulation of papers like the Ioannidis paper, why most published research findings are false, which actually draws a lot on the PPUV as well as the positive predictive value, as we briefly discussed yesterday with Uli Diernagel, which is more general medical in the medical community. But there are also other papers that are more situated in the neuroimaging community. For example, the famous/infamous voodoo correlation paper by Ed Wool, which basically asks why there's so much awesome data in emotion, personality, and social cognition neuroscience. The famous paper by Nico Kriegeskorte, which introduced the notion of double dipping, and now has every reviewer assuming that there might be some double dipping. Then the Button paper, which was also discussed, which makes the claim that basically the Button paper is just the Ioannidis paper with a rhetoric on neuroscience. And then you might also, or you should be aware, because you're on the OSF, might be aware of the Open Science collaboration and stuff that they do and trying to estimate the reproducibility of psychological science, and also doing things like installing the OSF to help with that. So what I want to stress here a little bit is that these papers are out there, and basically, from my perspective, if one reads them carefully, they are well in their rhetoric, and they also report on something that I also definitely perceived working in cognitive neuroimaging since 2006, that things are not as good as they should be. So that's definitely something that after some time in cognitive neuroscience you also become aware of, because you read papers and you're not quite sure what the authors did, although you have the paper, and if you also know how to do your analysis programming wise, you wonder why you don't have access to the code and why you cannot look at the data yourself and so on. So one definitely has the impression that things could be better. However, these papers, one should also, in a way, be aware that these papers didn't really provide much of empirical evidence for that, which is also hard to obtain, right? But sometimes I feel like these days people think there's a reproducible crisis in neuroscience, because, especially in neuroimaging, because also, or let's say in 2014 when the Cobidas stuff started, because there is this stir that something's going on. Although then if you look more closely, maybe it's not as bad. So just that one keeps that in mind, and that one also doesn't, because that's sometimes really annoying, because you also have to think about that cognitive neuroscience is, of course, just one aspect of many sciences. And then if things happen like for example, 2016, when this Anders Eklund paper came out on cluster inference, which created a lot of fuss, and then saying that all FMI is wrong. And if you read closely, what it found is that if you use, for example, random field theory in a way that most people don't use it, so that given a cluster forming threshold, then there is actually not much of a problem. But if you use it in a way that is non-appropriate, then you get into problems. So, and then it's a little bit annoying if people just jump on this bandwagon and say, oh, everything is horrible and we are bad. So one should make things better, but also be aware that you can also make a career by claiming everybody's doing things wrong these days. So just trying to give a balanced view. And the thing with Cobidas was definitely, there were not any big studies that really said everything in FMI is wrong. But the OHBM committee realized that there is discussion about the validity of methods, which is always good, and to basically preempt kind of publications that claim FMI is all wrong. From my perspective, they took action. So what kind of action did they take? The OHBM Council made a statement on neuroimaging research and data integrity, which is also available, which essentially just says, we want to do a good job. So there's not really much in there. And they also formed and created a committee on best practices in data analysis and sharing. And this is where the name comes from. So that's the Committee in Best Practice Imaging. Where's the EI coming from? Not really sure, but it's the Committee on Best Practice in data analysis and sharing. I guess it must be in. Or then the P is missing, but it definitely sounds okay as an abbreviation. So what was the aim of this committee? So the aim was to take kind of a community action to identify best practices of data analysis and data sharing and brain mapping, and then prepare a white paper, which is the Cobidas report, that organizes and describes these practices. The aim was also to do this not only in kind of the OHBM Council and associated committees, but also interact with the OHBM community on this, and then to publish the recommendations. One thing that maybe should be stressed here already is also that there have been white papers that kind of discuss how to report an FMI study also before. The kind of novel thing with Cobidas was that it also talks more about data sharing, which wasn't the case earlier.
So what does white paper mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I always use it. It's kind of a paper that is, first of all, it's not a paper where somebody tries to influence the community according to their view, but they write a paper that's more community-based, and it's something that kind of reflects the rules that the community wants to give itself. So that's how white papers are used in this context. I guess there's something like if you look on Wikipedia, there might be more history, and maybe someone knows a little bit more history on the notion of white papers, but that's what that essentially means. It's kind of a recommendation paper by more than one person or something like that. And this white paper, or the proposed version of the report, was then posted in the internet at this WordPress blog in 2015. And then, so there was a first proposal when everybody could look at it, and then there was ratification in May 2016. I remember, when was that? 2016. I remember being present when Tom Nichols, who's one of the leading forces behind this, presented this stuff at OHBM in the town hall meeting. Was it in Geneva? Because I'm mixing that up.
No, that wasn't.
Whether he was
2016 was Geneva.
That was Geneva, yeah. But did he present it there? Because I no, I think it was. I'm not quite sure. So I was at OHBM also in 2014. That was in Hamburg, and at either 2014 or 2016, this was presented. But I think it's actually in Geneva because the voting was in 2016. So I think it was the results of the voting were presented in 2016. I think because I remember that he presented that. There was a 96% approval of that. And he didn't say that there was actually a voting turnout of 153 yes and 6 no votes, which clearly doesn't reflect the community in terms of size, because the neuroimaging community is quite a lot larger. So it's kind of, after all, I mean, the neuroimaging community had the opportunity to vote on that, but most people somehow were not aware of this or did not care or whatever. So it kind of still reflects to a large degree the opinions of few people, but the other people also in the community, they just didn't care. So I was aware that this exists, and also I'm one of the 153 who said yes, but don't know. It's kind of the same number you actually have when you have these town hall meetings at HBM. Nobody ever goes there. So it's good. So that you know that. So it's kind of the community is behind that, even if it's kind of a sub part of the community, maybe. So how is this Cobidas report then to be used, and how is it communicated? So the idea is, with this Cobidas paper, and especially the appendices, one can increase transparency in neuroimaging by allowing and enforcing, in a way, the comprehensive sharing of data, methods, and results, because it gives very clear instructions of what should be reported, for example, in the methods sections, and how results should be communicated. And as this, it's kind of a checklist to increase reproducibility. What is also very important about this, because you soon also will be reviewers, this is a tool and not a law. And so when I review papers that where I find the methods being really not up to the standard of the field, I usually point people towards this paper or this older paper also by Wes Poldrak, who was also involved in the Cobidas on guidelines for reporting fMRI study. But I think it would not be a good use of the Cobidas report to use it as kind of a tool in trying to prevent publishing of papers. So, which is in any case, but that's a completely different issue. It's not the task of reviewers to decide whether something is interesting or not, and then trying to take down papers and so on. Anyway, so the see it really as a tool. It's actually it's very useful, and it also eases your life quite considerably if you don't always think, well, should I include this? Should I not include this? And what does my supervisor or advisor say? What should I do? You just have a relatively straightforward guideline on what to include in your paper, and then you can always say, if somebody says, well, that's not well written, then or this is not sufficient in reporting, then you can always say, well, I do what the community says because I'm following the Cobidas report. So use it please use it in a productive and positive manner rather than as a counterproductive manner. That's just what I think would be nice. So what's then the content? And maybe before going into the content, the Cobidas report now exists in essentially 2 versions, which is a little bit weird. And I think this has to do with also the way science is communicated, because there is a comment on the paper in Nature Neuroscience. So this is also on the OSF project. So they couldn't resist from having a high impact publication from the whole thing, which you can say, okay, it's necessary so that a lot of people know about it, but you can also say, why do they have to do it? Because there are now 2 versions of that, and the one that is in Nature Neuroscience does not really add any more information than what you find in this admittedly not very nicely formatted, but still content still much more rich and content loan version that exists on WordPress, and which I think you may have now opened. It looks like a manuscript is ready for submission, but that's actually the version. The Nature Neuroscience version doesn't have much content. There's just has the label Nature Neuroscience. So, having said that, what is now the content? And I'm talking here about the real Cobidas report, not the Nature Neuroscience comment on the Cobidas report. What's the content? And essentially, it explains what I so far explained, and then goes into some aspects that I now briefly review. So one thing that they thought about, because of course, as I said, that was coming from the perspective of perceiving that there is some worry about reproducibility in neuroimaging, and was kind of a countermeasure against non-reproducibility. They first thought about what they actually mean by reproducibility and defining reproducibility. So that's part of the content. And there they review different forms of reproducibility, starting with what is there called ISO repeatability. And ISO is this international standards organization, where ISO repeatability is the precision of measurements under conditions where independent test / measurement typo results are obtained with the same method on identical test measurement items in the same test or measuring facility by the same operator using the same equipment within short intervals of time. And so that's what they call repeatability, or what ISO calls repeatability. And this is not necessarily what people in science or in our kind of world of science would necessarily understand by reproducibility. Of course, it's some form of reproducibility, but it's a very strict form, and also, of course, requires that essentially the test conditions are exactly the same. Then they discussed the notion of ISO reproducibility, which goes a little bit more or is closer to what we think about reproducibility. So it's the precision of measurements under conditions where independent test measurement results are obtained with the same method on identical test measurement items in different test or measurement facilities with different operators using different equipment. And that's fair enough. It somehow speaks a little bit to what we are doing, but of course this also is related a lot to kind of making physical measurements, and it's not really talking much about what is actually also a large variability in or a big big variable in neuroimaging research, namely the analysis of the data. So one thing is to have kind of the identical data in neuroimaging, but then, of course, data analysis has become quite complex, so that making changes to analysis, data analysis pipelines definitely makes a difference in the final results. So this is not really addressed by this ISO repeatability or ISO reproducibility. Nevertheless, one has to keep in mind that this is kind of the general standard of what these terms mean. And there is a term that was introduced by Peng, or I'm not sure quite how you pronounce him, who proposed the term computational reproducibility for the kind of computational sciences. And here the idea is that independent researchers use the exact same data and code to arrive at the original result. And from my personal perspective, this is actually the reproducibility that we want to aim for. And in a way, this is also what Cobidas says. So from a personal viewpoint, whether given an experiment, some other facility will get very similar data. Who knows? I mean, if you have different participants, they might be different. So you have a lot of things that can change in terms of how the raw data are affected. But so I wouldn't see a big problem if, for example, experiments can't be reproduced in this kind of sense. Then you had one experiment, which was assuming that everything was well done, where the data looked like that. Then you do the same experiment again and again, and then you don't see that the first one was actually an outlier. Fair enough. But I think what is actually a problem is if it's not the results from a given paper are not even, or a given study are not even reproducible, because the code in terms of the analysis is hard to get your hands on, and then might not even be nicely documented. And if then other people try to run the code, it's also not working, and you get bugs and so on. So I think in terms of doing good work, not awesome or excellent or whatever work, but just good work, one should aim for computational reproducibility. That's my personal view. Again, replicability, independent researchers use independent data and possibly distinct methods to arrive at the same original conclusion. It's awesome, or whatever. If it's a sad finding, then it's not awesome, then it's sad. But is not something that, from my perspective, as an open/transparent, reproducible science aficionado, one should stress so much. I mean, again, we had the discussion was there yesterday already. Of course, it's important to be able to publish null results and so on. If all these things, if things would actually be a little bit better than they actually are, then one should only worry about computational reproducibility from my perspective. So, essentially, so the Cobidas report tries to aim at computational reproducibility. And then they have this table in there, which we don't discuss now in detail, where they basically discuss what is the same and what can be different across these different notions of reproducibility and replicability. It doesn't go much beyond the slide before, but it gives a little bit more detail. So that's kind of a more philosophical discussion that is in the Cobidas report, and also trying to emphasize that we are here after computational reproducibility, essentially. And then for each of these steps that are listed here, they give basically a set of guidelines of how these things should be handled. And it kind of works like a standard neuroimaging project. So it first starts with experimental design, then data acquisition, pre-processing, and statistical modeling, results reporting, and then also talks about data sharing and reproducibility. So I will not go into all of those. So essentially 2 to 5 I will just briefly talk about, and that's then something for the exercise. And the other ones I will now briefly review. So the first thing that I think is one of the most awesome features actually of the Cobidas report is that after, I don't know, when was that, 2016? After 25 years of fMRI, finally the question, what is a session versus what is a run, was settled. Because for a long time, so for the people that have been around in this for longer, London people called session that what US people called run. And that was always existing, and everybody knew that, but it was just annoying. And if you then had papers, you could understand what's going on if you knew whether these were kind of European SPM influenced people or whether these were Americans, and it was annoying. And the US essentially won. So the definition that is given in the Cobidas report is now that a session is the experimental session that encompasses the time that the subject enters the scanner until they leave the scanner. And within a session, you can have multiple runs. And a run is a period of temporary continuous data acquisition using a single pulse sequence. So when people are in the scanner, that's a session, and there you have multiple runs. That there was some confusion about that. The other things I think were generally clear, although it's also nice to have kind of this distinction between trials and events. So volumes, it's kind of clear. Experimental condition, also kind of clear. A trial or alternatively event is a temporary isolated period in which a particular condition is presented or specific behavior is observed, and the idea is that you might have compound trials, and then compound trials have multiple events. And these kind of things is you can say, oh, I don't like this, it should be different. For example, we had good reasons why we call these things sessions and so on. But in a way, it also really doesn't matter. So as long as there's some standard, I think this is a really easy standard to follow. And it's like a kind of a dictionary, and this is the dictionary that holds. So let's not confuse ourselves with these details anymore, because there's no need to. So that's, I think, really good in the Cobidas report, and something that one should definitely adhere to all the time. Then there are tables and also some discussion in the early parts of the report on acquisition reporting, pre-processing reporting, statistical modeling and inference, and results reporting. And from my reading of this, essentially the crucial thing is that you know what you're doing. And of course, this is a big problem in neuroimaging because these toolboxes are around, and they are also with little programming and also data analytical or data processing skills quite easy to use and generate results. The problem is a lot of people can easily use these things without knowing exactly what actually is going on, which you then see if you see how people write up their papers. Because if you know about a certain thing in kinds of data analysis, then you also know how to report this. If you kind of have you're not quite sure what this actually means, what you're reporting, then you might also easily make mistakes in how to report this. So one example that I am still working on, so I specialize a little bit more on data analysis rather than data acquisition. So I'm definitely not an expert on MR physics, but I know, and you know, that in every paper you have this sentence, the flip angle was this, the TE and this, and so on. And this is definitely what I can write in a paper because it's relatively easy. You just need to check your sequence parameters. But if anyone would ask me as a reviewer, so you wrote that you have this, can you explain a little bit? So we actually had a situation like that. Then it requires for me quite some effort to actually figure out what this means. And this is kind of, yeah, I mean, you cannot in each paper develop the whole theory of MRI physics because that's in a way not your job. But of course, it's also maybe a little bit too easy, or I don't know, not too easy, but you can get away. Let's say you can get away with kind of superficial knowledge that you convey to the outside without the outside questioning that. sometimes maybe even because the reviewers also have no idea what these little things are about. So, and this is the thing that comes with a lot of complexity in the science we are doing. So what I want to say here is that these sections in the Cobidas report, if you know how these data analytical things work, then everything that's written in the Cobidas report is quite natural. Sometimes you ask yourself, wow, okay, one can stress that, one can stress that, but it's not something that is really where there's some additional gain or something. So what I would rather encourage you to do is, rather than trying to stick in a way to the Cobidas report, is trying to really develop your methodological knowledge on things. So really make this, as a neuroimaging person, this should be, and as every scientist, essentially for every scientist, that should be your priority, with, on the one hand, creating scientific insight, and on the other hand, know actually what you're doing and how you're doing things influences what you make in terms of scientific inferences. So, so far about that. Then data sharing. And because I said this is kind of the new part in Cobidas, what do they say about data sharing? So what they make explicit is with data sharing, they don't mean what you also find a lot in papers, that the data are available upon request, reasonable request to the first author or something. So they encourage with the Cobidas report in kind of standardized and default approach to data sharing. About the FAIR principles, we will talk on Wednesday. There's also a workshop on that. So that's what they encourage, so that it's an essential project component. The data should use appropriate licenses. They actually mention Creative Commons licenses there, although OpenFMI actually doesn't use Creative Commons but public domain licenses. The insiders know about what I'm talking here. Data sharing also doesn't just mean the raw data, but should definitely include the data analysis and pipeline scripts. And they also give actually a time recommendation, because it should happen at the time of study publication. And that's all fair and great and so on. And it would be really good if things were like that. There is one constraint, and I guess it's in some of your minds already, specifically if you're from Germany, Europe. Namely, what they also write is that data sharing should respect the appropriate ethical and legal constraints. And this is essentially the recommendation they give for that. And this is also where they stop. So if you have ever discussed sharing your neuroimaging data with your supervisor or anyone, people who are not that keen on sharing data, and also people who are very sensitive and rightly so, or to data protection issues, might say, that's not a good idea. And to cut that short, the debate is still out there, so we're working on a paper how maybe given the GDPR, so the European General Data Protection Regulation, we can still make neuroimaging data sharing work. This report was written, it's Tom Nichols, it's also Russ Poldrack, it's OpenFMI informed. So in the US, they definitely have less issues with data protection. So the thing is, it also doesn't solve the data protection issue for those who feel more affected by it. So unfortunately, that's not what Cobidas delivers. So it doesn't say, if you're in Germany, see, we really studied the data protection law, and this is how you can make your neuroimaging data available. That's not in the report. But definitely it makes a case for data sharing. And it says that you should at least share your data analysis code. And there, except for licenses, you don't have any issues in doing that. So just for today and your studies, please, when you write your next neuroimaging paper, just organize the scripts in a nice way. Delete everything that could be sensitive with respect to participant information. And so if you, for some reason, but because of the bits you will not do that anyway, but for some reason have some acronyms for participants in there, delete all of that and just put out the code on GitHub or whatever with your publication. Because it's you get so much insight as a reviewer on how the project was conducted and what is going on from code. I mean that in two ways. So one is kind of, if you see that everything is all over the place, then I think, everything is all over the place. The other thing is that some things are really hard to convey in words. They are much easier to convey in formulas and so in math, but often this is not the style that is chosen. And then it's really sometimes hard to understand from like 2 or 3 sentences what happened. And if you just see the code, then you are like, okay, so that's what happened. So please do that, because it helps so much. And it also helps you, because you have kind of a version, and this is of course the idea behind all of this data sharing. You have a version that was the version that how the data was analyzed, and you don't have the things that you sometimes have, that if you don't organize your code for sharing, that in the end and a couple of months later you're actually not quite sure what you actually did. So this is, it would be a good workshop on its own to just writing code in a way that is such that it aims for reproducibility, because you don't need all these things like version control systems and so on. You just need to write nice code. Maybe at another occasion I will again say what I mean by writing nice code. But what you should always keep in mind, and this is also good in terms of code writing, is when you write code, never aim for quick and fast solutions, but for solutions that are kind of sustainable, and always have in the back of your mind that people will read your code, because this increases the way you write code so much. Because if you always think, I'm just doing it for myself and to really get this figure out because my supervisor wants to see this figure, so let's do it, and now I want to go home and there's hockey training. So if you write code like that, it will be crap. If you always think, okay, I'm writing this, and all these smart people in the field, they will look at my code. Nobody will really look at your code. Maybe one reviewer will do. The other reviewer will be too busy. But anyway, so if you have this in the back of your head, at least for me, this made a big difference in how I wrote code. So much for data sharing, reproducibility. We basically covered that already. So that stresses computational reproducibility. And this again relates back to the code, requires that the analysis scripts are documented, archived, and citable. So please put in comments into your codes, write a lot of comments into your code what this thing is doing, and put them in not only on your laptop that then was stolen after you changed labs or something, but put them onto a platform that is likely to persist, such that is also citable, because then you can write, so all data analysis code in this paper is available from, and then you say that, and then people can look at it and think, awesome, that's really nice code.
Yeah. So if you were doing pre-processing with SPM using batch, you made a batch in the GUI, this is classically how I've done it, make a batch in the GUI and then loop through that batch. In terms of publishing your code, would it be sufficient to publish the batch map file? I
would think so, yes. In general, I would also advise to actually run the code, because then you also you know that you can create an SPM, you can create code based on the way. So why not do it? And then also put in your own comments, because of course batches you cannot. You can write an extensive README, but I think it's easier to. So I think definitely in terms of SPM programming, since in the old days. which were not the old days, but I call them the old days. SPM scripting was a little bit hard because you needed to go quite deep into things. But with the SPM batch editor, you just need basic coding skills to actually be able to script your analysis. So please do that. I actually have just some advertising. If you go to my website to teaching, you see that we also did some lectures on SPM programming. So there I explain, like in these videos, where you can click in the GUI and then create your code and how you adapt the code. So I'm talking a lot about the code, how to write the code. But it's actually essentially the code is just code that says click that button. So it's not really kind of algorithmic code in a way. But yeah, you can easily look at that.
Is that on your personal website?
Yeah, so on my lab website. So there's teaching. You can also find many videos on GLN and other stuff. Then it should use DOIs for permanent citability. That's what we actually said. Good. So this is essentially what I wanted to say. So are there questions right now, or do you want to learn about the exercise now? Any questions that we should address? I guess there will be questions about the exercise. So you can also create your own Cobidas exercise. If you have a better exercise that I think that might help you with learning about Cobidas, for example, I would think it would help me just read this rather than doing such an exercise. But this exercise also can help you. So hands-on exercise idea is that you look at Appendix D of the Cobidas report, which is actually the meat of the Cobidas report. And there is basically tables. I saw there was, I don't know, did anyone go to this critical appraisal workshop? Did that already happen? It's in the next room. Okay, so because the critical appraisal framework is, from what I saw on OSF, is essentially a Cobidas report, because it has kind of a list that asks, was it reported how many female and male participants were or something, but it's kind of a very short Cobidas report with maybe some more general applicabilities. So if you go to Appendix D of the Cobidas report, this really is tailored to neuroimaging data analysis and is relatively extensive. So I think it would be a good exercise to become familiar with that if you, for some paper that you know, maybe for your own paper, if you have already written something, or if you have a paper that you're constantly reading because it's kind of the basis of your PhD work, or I have put up two example papers which you can also use to check whether they your own paper or any kind of paper actually follows these Cobidas guidelines, or if something is missing, or if people go beyond that. I don't think you will, if you look into Appendix D of Cobidas, so there are, I think, these 9 sections. I don't think you will be able to do all of them. It's also not the point. I don't know. We could do it that you do that if you want to do it in pairs and we cover all of it, and you do the first, you do the second, and so on. Anyone saying this is horrible, I don't want to do that, so that we later get from every part of Cobidas a little bit of a feedback? Yeah, maybe we'll just do it like that. So how many sections are in Appendix D? Yeah. I think 9 or something.
7.
Ooh! That's no.
Wait,
No, it just takes some time.
yeah.
Good.
7.
7. Okay, so then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I have to do something as well. Okay, and then so just have a look at it, talk about it, and choose. So we have one more option: whether we all use one paper or we use different papers. Who wants to use all one paper? No one. So we.
Maybe one would be nice if we're all looking at different aspects.
That's true. On the other hand, I cannot really say whether. Okay, then let's do. Okay, then we do it this way. So there is. I didn't choose these papers for any specific reasons. I just chose them for the reason that they are high impact. But I didn't choose them because I have the feeling that they are doing a very bad job or they are doing a very good job or anything. So then let's briefly decide whether we want to look at. Maybe we just decide that we want to. So the Edelson paper has DCN in it. This one doesn't have DCN in it. That's what I know. But it has some so maybe let's look at the Colling paper. Then everybody. So it's just GLM. So it's most basic. So let's just check. Yeah, that's a good exercise. Then let's just check for the Colling paper in how far they basically adhere to that or go beyond what is required or fall short of it. Okay. Yeah. So it's also time to relax a little bit and chat and whatever. There will be there will be coffee at one point. We just need to make sure that we get also 2 bits. So maybe let's do how do
We could have coffee while we listen.
you can have coffee while you are working on that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but the coffee is only it's at 2:30 or so.
Just go up, comes back.
Yeah.
Okay, so then I don't worry about this. And then let's say, how much time do you want for the exercise?
All the biscuits back.
Half an hour, 20 minutes for the exercise?
Let's try
20 minutes, okay. So then let's discuss at 2:20.
And then hang them over paper.
That's fine, we're learning about it again. That's all we do. Where the actual sections are